never considered myself the superstitious type, and I'd been on enough road trips to know that the scariest things you usually encounter are bad gas station bathrooms and questionable diners. But that was before last summer's drive down the coast. I was heading from Seattle to Los Angeles to visit an old friend. I'd left a little later than planned, hoping to get some distance before the night closed in. By the time I reached Southern Oregon, it was pitch black outside, and the back roads I'd taken were completely deserted. I'd underestimated just how empty the stretches between small towns could be at night. Around 2 a.m., I'd been driving for hours, the drowsiness creeping into my bones. When I saw a sign for a rest stop, I decided to pull over. It was a tiny rundown place off the side of the highway, just a dimly lit parking lot with a single building that housed bathrooms and a couple of vending machines. There wasn't another car in sight, and I could only hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I parked my car close to the entrance and cut the engine, sinking into the sudden, heavy silence. A wave of unease washed over me, and I chalked it up to fatigue. I told myself I'd be quick, just run in, splash some water on my face, and get back on the road. The bathroom was at the far end of the building, past a row of broken-down vending machines. As I walked toward it, the flickering lights above cast strange shadows that seemed to jump and stretch on the cracked pavement. I told myself it was just the flickering bulbs, but it felt like something, or someone, was watching. The men's room door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and inside, the air was stale and damp. There were 3 stalls, and each door hung slightly ajar, revealing toilets that hadn't been cleaned in a while. I was relieved to see I was alone. I went to the sink, and just as I leaned over to turn on the faucet, I heard a soft shuffle behind me. I snapped my head up, staring at the grimy mirror. No one was there, but I could have sworn I'd heard footsteps. A slow, dragging sound like someone limping. "Hello?" My voice echoed back at me, but there was no response. I shook it off as paranoia. I hadn't slept, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. I splashed some water on my face, feeling the cold sting, hoping it would clear the fog from my brain. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it again. The dragging sound, but this time closer, right outside the bathroom door. My heart began to race. I held my breath, straining to listen, and then silence. I waited a moment, hoping whoever it was would just go away. After a few seconds, I slowly pushed the bathroom door open. The parking lot was still empty, except now there was a shadow at the edge of the building near my car. It looked like a person hunched over, almost crouching. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud even to me. The figure didn't move. I felt every instinct screaming at me to get out of there, but my keys were in my pocket, and I knew I had to get to my car. I took a few hesitant steps toward it, keeping my eyes on the figure. But as I got closer, I noticed something wrong. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, almost like it was broken. Even worse, it wasn't just standing still. It was swaying, slightly, from side to side, as though it was waiting. The closer I got, the more details I could make out, and I wished I hadn't. Its clothes were tattered, barely hanging onto its thin frame, and its skin was a sickly, grayish color, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. My footsteps slowed, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. Just then, the figure turned its head toward me, and I froze. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and a strange, twisted smile stretched across its face, as if it was glad I'd finally noticed it. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep moving. I took my keys out, trying not to make any sudden moves. The thing just stood there, watching me with that terrible grin. I couldn't tell if it was alive or something else entirely, but I didn't want to find out. I got to my car, unlocked it as quickly as I could, and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. For a moment I felt safe behind the glass, but as I reached to start the engine, I glanced up and saw the thing standing right outside my window, its face pressed against the glass. It shouldn't have been possible. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen it come closer. But now it was there, inches from me, staring at me with those empty eyes. Its fingers were thin, almost skeletal, and it started tapping on the window, slow and deliberate. I couldn't breathe. My hands fumbled over the ignition, trying to get the car started. The tapping continued, relentless and measured, and that grin never faltered. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, peeling out of the parking lot. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My heart pounded as I sped down the highway, convinced it was right behind me. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that face staring back at me. After a while, the adrenaline started to fade, and I tried to convince myself it was over, that I'd imagined it in my exhaustion. Just as I was beginning to calm down, a cold chill ran down my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and froze. There, in the back seat, was the same twisted figure, sitting perfectly still, its empty eyes meeting mine in the mirror. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road, but when I turned around, the back seat was empty. I sat there for a while, shaking, my mind reeling. I couldn't trust what I was seeing anymore, couldn't tell if it was real or some waking nightmare. I drove the rest of the way in a daze, my eyes darting to the mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see it again. When I finally reached my friend's place, it was nearly morning, and I stumbled out of the car, exhausted and shaken. For days after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked into a mirror or a window, I half expected to see those hollow eyes staring back at me. That was months ago. I've avoided driving alone at night since, and I'll never stop at another empty rest stop again. And even now, when I'm alone in my apartment, sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, or a figure just beyond my line of sight. And every time, I get the sinking feeling that it's waiting, patiently, for me to look just a little too long. I remember it vividly, as if it happened yesterday, though it's been a few years now. It was a road trip meant to be an escape, a break from the monotony of everyday life. My college friends and I decided to take a spontaneous drive down the old Route 66, exploring the forgotten towns that dotted the vast American landscape. Little did we know, our adventure would turn into a nightmarish tale I would never forget. We started our journey with high spirits, the car packed with snacks, laughter echoing within the confines of the vehicle. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, we found ourselves in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched infinitely into the distance, flanked by barren lands that seemed to swallow the sunlight. It was around dusk when we noticed the gas gauge was nearing empty. We had been driving for hours without seeing a single soul or sign of civilization. Panic began to creep in, but just as despair was about to settle, we spotted an old, dilapidated sign that read, "Gas station, 2 miles ahead." Relief washed over us, and we drove eagerly towards it. The station was a relic from the past, a ghost of the thriving route it once serviced. Its neon lights flickered weakly against the gathering darkness, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. We parked the car beside one of the rusted pumps and got out, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was still, heavy with the scent of rain and decay. An inexplicable chill ran down my spine as I surveyed the desolate surroundings. The windows of the station were boarded up, and the only light came from the flickering neon sign above, spelling out GAS in letters that sputtered and buzzed intermittently. "Weird place," Jake, my friend, muttered, voicing what we were all thinking. We approached the entrance cautiously, half expecting someone to appear and welcome us in. But there was no one, only the oppressive silence. I pushed open the door and it creaked ominously, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust coated every surface and cobwebs hung like forgotten memories from the ceiling. The place had an unsettling aura, as if time had stopped within its walls, leaving behind only echoes of the past. There was a counter at the far end, and behind it, shelves lined with old expired goods. As I walked further in, a peculiar sensation prickled at the back of my neck. a feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the eerie atmosphere. While my friends debated whether we should stay or leave, I wandered towards the back of the station, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity. There, I found a door slightly ajar, leading to what appeared to be a storage room. I hesitated, the instinct to turn back almost overwhelming, but something compelled me to push it open. Inside, the air was colder, and a strange metallic scent lingered. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed old, faded photographs pinned to the walls. They were of people, families, travelers, and workers, each one smiling, unaware of the fate that would befall them. A shiver ran down my spine when I realized that none of the photos were recent. They all seemed to belong to a bygone era. Suddenly, a soft rustling sound broke the silence. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just shadows dancing in the corners, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I turned to leave, a growing sense of dread urging me to escape. But then I noticed something on the floor, a dusty, worn journal. I picked it up, feeling the weight of its history in my hands, and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten entries that detailed the daily life of the station's owner. The mundane entries slowly gave way to something more sinister, a gradual descent into paranoia and fear. The last entry was scrawled in a frantic hand, almost illegible. They watch from the dark. I hear them at night. I must not sleep. They come when you sleep. A sudden loud bang from the front of the store jolted me from my thoughts. My heart raced as I rushed back to my friends, clutching the journal tightly. They were gathered near the entrance, eyes wide with fear. The door. It slammed shut by itself, Emma whispered, her voice trembling. We all exchanged nervous glances, the reality of our situation sinking in. The gas station, forgotten and isolated, felt alive with a presence we couldn't fathom. Let's just get the gas and leave, Jake suggested, trying to sound braver than he felt. We all nodded in agreement, eager to escape the clutches of the eerie place. But as we fumbled with the pump, it became clear that it was as dead as the station itself. No gas flowed, only a hollow silence that seemed to mock our desperation. The realization hit us like a cold wave. There was no way out, not without fuel. A feeling of doom settled over us, the oppressive night closing in. With no other choice, we decided to wait until morning, hoping for a miracle or a passerby. We huddled together in the car, the journal sitting ominously between us. Sleep eluded us, fear and paranoia growing with every passing minute. Shadows loomed larger, and every creak of the wind felt like the footsteps of unseen watchers. The words of the journal echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the station's dark history. Hours dragged by, and just when the sky began to lighten, a sudden noise jolted us awake. A soft melodic tune, like a lullaby, drifting through the air. It was coming from the station, a haunting invitation that filled us with dread. We sat frozen, the melody weaving its way into our minds, lulling us into a trance. It was then that I understood the journal's warning. The station was more than a forgotten relic. It was a trap, a siren in the night, luring the unsuspecting to their doom. With every ounce of willpower, I broke free from the song's grasp and shook my friends awake. "We have to go now," I shouted, urgency snapping them out of their stupor. We abandoned the car, running into the pale morning light, away from the cursed station. As we stumbled down the road, the melody faded, replaced by the sound of our ragged breaths and pounding hearts. Eventually, we reached a small town, and help came in the form of a kindly old man who didn't question our frantic state. As we recounted our tale, his expression shifted to one of grim understanding. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "That station's been abandoned for decades. Folks say it's haunted by the souls of those who got lost in the night. We never did recover the car, and none of us dared to return. The experience left an indelible mark, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can lurk in forgotten places. Even now, I can't drive past an old gas station without feeling the ghostly pull of that haunting lullaby, a sinister serenade that continues to echo in my dreams. I'll never forget that night. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was somewhere on an empty stretch of highway between Montana and North Dakota, just trying to get home. The road was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows the world whole, and all I could hear was the low hum of my engine and the gentle tap of the road beneath my tires. I was running on coffee and pure stubbornness, fighting to keep my eyes open, when I saw her. At first, I thought I was just seeing things, but as I got closer, there was no mistaking it. A young woman was standing on the shoulder, her thumb outstretched, her face turned toward my approaching headlights. She was dressed in a pale, loose-fitting dress that looked thin enough to shiver through in the cold night air. Something about her looked off, but it was freezing out, and she didn't have a jacket, so I figured she must have been in some kind of trouble. I pulled over, rolling down the passenger side window just enough to ask her where she was heading. She leaned in, her face partially obscured by her hair, which hung in damp strands over her eyes. "Just up the road," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of my idling car. It wasn't much to go on, but I was too tired to overthink it. "Get in," I said, pushing open the door. She slid inside without a word, her movements smooth and oddly silent, like she weighed nothing at all. The air in the car seemed to shift as soon as she closed the door. It got colder, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, like someone had walked over my grave. I glanced over at her, trying to get a better look at her face, but she kept it turned toward the window, staring out at the darkness. For some reason, I had this weird feeling that I shouldn't ask her too many questions, so I just kept driving. After a few miles, the silence started to get to me. I cleared my throat and tried to make some small talk. "So, where are you headed?" "Home," she murmured, barely moving. Her voice was hollow, distant, like she was talking to herself more than to me. I nodded, not sure what to make of that. "Been out here long?" I asked, hoping to pry a little more out of her. "A long time," she replied, her tone flat. She still hadn't looked at me, not once. The road stretched on, endless and empty. Every mile marker seemed to blend into the next, and I started to lose track of time. I was getting that feeling again, the one that told me something wasn't right. It felt like I was being watched, but whenever I glanced over, she was just staring out the window as if the darkness outside held some kind of fascination for her. Then she started humming, just this low, eerie hum that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like an old lullaby, slow and haunting, a tune that felt familiar but wrong somehow, like something from a bad dream. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my hands starting to sweat, but I kept my eyes on the road, not daring to look at her. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She stopped humming and slowly turned her head to face me. Her eyes, I still remember the way they looked. Empty, like she wasn't really seeing me. Just two dark pits that seemed to swallow the light from the dashboard. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question took me off guard, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I forced a nervous laugh, hoping to shake off the sudden tension. "Not really," I said, glancing over at her. "But I've seen some weird things out on the road." She didn't smile. Instead, she just stared at me, unblinking, her gaze heavy and unnerving. "Sometimes they're closer than you think," she murmured, her voice trailing off. I don't know why, but her words sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my focus on the road. Every part of me was screaming to get her out of my car. But we were in the middle of nowhere with no towns or lights in sight, so I just kept driving, counting down the minutes until I could drop her off somewhere. Anywhere. We'd been on the road for what felt like an eternity when she suddenly pointed out the window. "Here," she said, her voice low but urgent, Stop here." I looked around, but there was nothing. Just an old broken-down road sign half buried in the tall grass. I pulled over anyway, more than ready to let her out. "Are you sure this is where you want to get off?" I asked, trying to mask the relief in my voice. She nodded, her eyes fixed on something in the distance that I couldn't see. Without another word, she opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. I watched as she walked a few paces away from the car, her figure fading into the night. She never looked back. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I couldn't help but wonder what she was doing out here, alone with no sign of civilization in sight. But as I was about to drive off, something compelled me to get out of the car and take one last look. I stepped out into the cold night, squinting into the darkness where she had disappeared. But there was nothing. No sign of her anywhere. Just the wind rustling through the grass and the faint hum of my engine. Then, something caught my eye. Near the base of the broken sign, half hidden in the weeds, was an old, weathered backpack. It looked like it had been out there for years, its fabric faded and torn. I picked it up, feeling a strange sense of dread settle over me as I opened the main compartment. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. I unfolded it carefully, my hands shaking as I read the faded words scrawled across the page. Missing. Sarah Green. Last seen wearing a white dress along Highway 94. The date at the bottom was from over 10 years ago. I dropped the paper, my heart pounding as I looked around, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out into the night. I practically ran back to my car, slamming the door shut and locking it, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the ignition. As I sped off, my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she been real? Or had I just picked up something else? Something that wasn't supposed to be here anymore? I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I parked at an all-night diner and stumbled inside, desperate for the warmth and the presence of other people. As I sat down, I tried to tell myself it was all just a bad dream, that my mind was playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road. But as I was sipping my coffee, I overheard a conversation at the next table. Two truckers were talking, their voices low and serious. One of them mentioned a story he'd heard about a girl who'd been hitchhiking on Highway 94, a girl who'd disappeared years ago but was still seen from time to time, asking for a ride. I felt my stomach drop, the coffee turning sour in my mouth. When I finally got back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was somehow marked. And even now, every time I pass a hitchhiker on an empty road, I keep my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look. Because I know, no matter how much I try to convince myself otherwise, that she's still out there waiting for someone else to pick her up.